Welcome back to The Doctor is In with Dr. Nadia Saba. Today we're continuing our interview with Dr. Gary Stutte from last week for our special series, What Plants Crave from Technology. Thank you for growing with us.
It's amazing. It's so amazing. Are there any other technologies that NASA adopted early or developed that we're also applying in our terrestrial indoor farms and greenhouses?
Oh, I think, that's the most dramatic one, I think. But there are, materials like we have porous tubes for watering, on-demand watering. So the plants will just pull those out. So you have a little pressure sensor. It comes, the same porous tubes, fitted materials for the recovery of water. So you can run that through and purify water back and forth. Filters for removing the volatile organic compounds from the atmosphere, especially important there in the cannabis industry. But within the more traditional ones were oxidizers to remove ethylene, to scrub ethylene mechanically out. Yeah, it's so because you're in this really, really small system. They're old-time anecdotes. Some of the very first experiments in space, they were growing wheat. They looked very well. They had heads. And then when they harvest the head on the Russian Shpet off the Mir space station, there were no seeds in them. Ultimately, they found that the seeds had aborted because of these very high levels of ethylene in the chamber. Early experiments with peas would have that abortion because the plants were now moving in those air, but the CO2 and ethylene inside the pods would get to extremely high levels because of no convective mixing. There's nowhere for it to go. So there were, over things that are taken for granted here on Earth, it has enabled, efficient technologies to be applied on small scales that are now being, scaled up and incorporated into, you've got humidification system, atmospheric purification system, UV treatment of, water and air. Much of that began in, our efforts to get pure, safe water circulating around a clean system. Certainly advances in automation and such, but once you get into the ground and continuous monitoring of sensors, solid state sensors, solid state light, miniaturization, all of those things were necessary. On a very first experiment, there were all kinds of things, and we were growing them up on space, and it was all very, very cool. And we'd have problems, and data would come down. And I realized at some point in the middle that the closest I ever came to my experiment was 260 miles when it was directly overhead. And that was, and I had a, interested, highly competent person, but not a horticulturist tending that experiment. So I was reliant upon that engineering, the data, those infrastructures, and that knowledge of how those environments interacted within a particular chamber that resulted in plant growth to make decisions, which is not unlike, much of the, agriculture today in this emerging indoor agriculture field, where it is automated, it's being controlled remotely, or even if it's not remotely and it's off a computer screen on the other side of the wall, I don't have to see the plants. But what I need are the technologies for the plants to be able to communicate to me how they're feeling, what their needs are, how I can respond to them. And, that is the technology that, NASA excels in. And, that applying. But ultimately, it's not the technology that's the driver. It is the plant, and it is our ability to synthesize what those data streams are telling us to get the most out of that plant under the conditions they are in. And they may not be optimal, but we need to know what we can do to push them to their limits without breaking them.
Are there particular plants? I mean, I know that you described some of the features that you're looking for in terms of air exchange and water and food and harvest index, but are there any plants you've grown that maybe weren't really good at doing those things, but thrived in microgravity or space?
Well, a Arabidopsis seems to do good, but you can't eat it.
Boring.
We've grown an awful lot of Arabidopsis up there, but things, I'm not aware of any.
Okay.
I mean, that's a really interesting question. That's gonna, it's gonna take some time. I mean, there are things that have low harvest index that have done well, like wheat or soybeans have been grown. There are things that have grown and produce flowers like the zinnias that were grown in the veggie that's been up there now. But they had a struggle getting that plant in. I wouldn't say they thrived, but they survived and they demonstrated what was possible. And if we can demonstrate that possibility on these low emissions and these, shall we say, lower fidelity growth chambers, in much ways, it's humans breaking that 4-minute mile. Once somebody's done it, then it's easy to do it. When you
right,
it's like we can do this now. So now dozens of plants have been grown in that environment with low humidity, high fluctuating CO2. Are they optimal? No. Are they where you'd want them to be? Probably not. But do we have a baseline from where they are at to where we know they can be? Yes.
I mean, that's an interesting comment because I'm kind of curious, especially indoor growers, whether they're growing lettuce or they're growing cannabis, right? They always want really super tight control of their environmental conditions but when you're in space, it seems like based on what you just described too, that plants, need to tolerate maybe some high levels of something or low levels of something else. Have we learned through some of the space research that the tolerance range of some of these parameters with different plants, that maybe it doesn't need to be so tight, and we, like you said, maybe it's not optimal, but it's good enough?
Right. Yes. And, some of those operating ranges are like carbon dioxide. That, what's that optimal region? And I don't like that term particularly. Living here in Florida and just down the road from Daytona, the difference between, an optimal engine and a blown engine is just a few torque. So, we don't want to be there. What we want is to get past that finish line in first place, second place, or at least in the money. And, that is where we did an awful lot of work, and it's still going on out there by a very talented team of folks, finding those limits under that environment. High CO2, relatively low humidity, fluctuating temperatures. Things that came out is that CO2 concentrations, as I'm sure you're quite familiar, and many of the listeners, as you increase CO2, you're going to get more growth. You're going to grow faster because you're getting the raw material. Light and CO2 is, food. But it gets up to a point somewhere around 1,000 part per million. Nothing really changes till you get about 3,000 part per million, and then it starts to turn around and stomata open back up, water starts coming through, growth starts to go around. There's an upper limit to that. Similarly, there are ranges on temperature, that temperature response curve, and humidity control. Where is it humidity? Is it VPD? What's the amount of absolute water in the atmosphere that a particular plant can manage at a particular time. It's not a magic number, it's a range. And understanding that is the talent and skill of the master grower, which is, the efforts to incorporate that into a control system, I don't think has reached that point, because there's not that optimum. There are ranges, there are compromises. And what you don't want, in Gary's view, is, one plant to survive at its best. What you want is this warehouse of 100,000 square feet of plant material to come out as a consistent quality day in and day out. So what is that functional range to give you that quality? And those different qualities vary according to the grower, to the customer, to the clientele. So it's what's the optimum? It's like, well, what's your optimum diet? It depends on the time of the day and the time of the week, and
if you're training for a marathon or
absolutely, very, very much. It can be very controlled, but that's a very stressful situation too.
Yeah, that's true. You said my favorite word, which is vapor pressure deficit. I guess that's 3 words. My favorite term.
Say it really quick. VPD.
Yeah, VPD. There you go. It's 1 word. Like SyNRGE, 1 word.
That's right.
But you got me thinking when you said that, and I can't believe I didn't think about it earlier, but at this low pressure on Mars and in space, I mean, do we need brand new VPD charts? I mean, what are, our sort of, I'll just say a rule of thumb of targeting 1 kilopascal, right? Plus or minus. Does that go out the window? Does that go out? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, you don't have you don't have a 2-dimensional psychometric chart. You have a 3-dimensional psychometric space. So you don't have temperature and humidity or water. So you're checking dew point and absolute dew point, and where you're getting the dew point, now you're adjusting that on pressure. And that is a predictable measure. You can, the amount of water that can be held at different pressures. At a particular elevation, 0.6 instead of 101 kilopascals, you're at 66 kilopascals or 33 kilopascals. How much water is in there?
Oh my God.
What's 100? So, we were consistently growing down to 33 kilopascals. You get down to 10 kilopascals, you can't keep up. The water evaporates as fast as you.
Wow.
And then it's cooling. And so you do that enough, you can evaporate so quickly, you can freeze the plant.
So do you have to pressurize water delivery to the plants to prevent it from evaporating to atmosphere?
No, the plant transpiration will drive that naturally through it in the environment that we grow, in a closed environment. If you're in the vacuum of space, well, yes.
Okay.
In the vacuum of space, things aren't going to grow. So typically what we're looking at, or where we can cohabitate the plants and the people. And we typically have a lot of overlap in temperature ranges and humidity ranges that we can tolerate, or perhaps separating them, but they're not outside those ranges a lot. So perhaps you can go lower, on plant material, because you're going to go, well, you reduce the pressure, your VPD is greater, so you're going to be pumping more water out of it. So more water is being pumped out of it. The evaporative cooling is going to be greater, but there's still not going to be that much water in the air because you're at 1/3 of the atmosphere. So your VPD is really high the absolute water is relatively low compared to 100 kPa.
Interesting.
I mean, it's a different way of thinking.
Yeah, it is. It is. Do plants, and in the absence of I don't know, Earth's gravitational force, do
Right.
they grow in a weird direction, or do they still kind of grow up? And what is up? Towards the light?
Plants will grow in whatever direction they take off, because there's no way that you don't have those gravitational controls of which way is up. What we call gravitropism. Roots will tend to go up, and then they'll turn down, and then there's shoots will go up. In the absence of gravity, whichever way it comes out of a seed, they're just going to keep going. That requires, the physiological control of a couple of other things. One is the phototropism. So now with light, I can tell a plant which way I want it to go. Is that up or down? Is irrelevant. I want them all to go to this way because that's where my light source is, and this way is my water source. If I turn it upside down and sideways, the plant doesn't know because there's no gravity. Or there is, like oxygen to tropism. So they're moving to oxygen or away from oxygen, away from CO2 or roots. Because roots need oxygen. Yeah. So, that if you see in waterlogged soils, they'll stay up like in the top. Well, we thought it was that they couldn't get to the water. Now we think it's like they're moving to oxygen. So they're sensing an oxygen gradient. Those don't exist. So you've got to use these environmental controls, which is a beautiful thing about plants, in Gary's view, is the number of redundant systems that they have. You take away gravity, you can use light. If you take away light, you can do an atmospheric composition. You can alter, light to make it go up, or the leaves to go up, or you can make them to go flat. There are different systems. If one biological system gets hit, there's a backup system. So there's a great deal of plasticity and an ability to adapt to a new environment.
Interesting. What are some of the biggest lessons we've learned about plants and just generally growing plants or the physiology of plants from the research we've done in space, and how do we apply that on Earth?
I'd say generally on the things that we learned in trying to keep people alive, not in space or on a different planet, in these closed systems, these controlled life support systems, was one initially was the potential of plants. That the first tests were, where we had the opportunity to provide really high light, optimize high CO2, control the water, control the photo period. Potato yields were twice world record yields in 2/3 the time. Wheat was 4 times the time of the world record yields. It's not, at that point. The models that were being developed at that time at Cornell University, we exceeded their production models by 20%. They got rewritten and are still used because we began to understand that biological potential was not being realized in the terrestrial ways we were traditionally growing plants. Now we had the opportunity to close them, give them much CO2 and light, push those limits of productivity. As light emitting diodes became available, we began able to alter the composition, the form, the function, the secondary metabolite composition by altering that environmental control. Those are tools that are just now coming into use in commercial horticulture. It's been kind of a slow road getting there, and it will continue to be, and probably rightfully so. But what that is changing that work that was necessary to stay alive and safe in a tight environment with maximum productivity, with minimum resources, is what's driving this emergent indoor agriculture industry. It's going to become even greater driver as the populations increase and resources become less. So whether that's on an indoor, or you're in a greenhouse, or finding ways to incorporate that closure within field agriculture or semi-closed systems is going to only intensify, because it has to. It's going to have to, otherwise we're going to suffer some serious consequences across the planet with limited resources and more people.
Yeah, and if we haven't figured out how to grow food in space, leaving Earth to colonize somewhere else is not going to be very successful until we figure out how to farm in space, I think.
What we are learning, farming in space is being adopted very, very quickly, in those concepts of closure are now being integrated into a new generation of farmers that are technologically savvy, understand engineering, and have the appreciation of what can be potential. So these incredible yields out of very tight places are changing the way we think of what's possible. And once you start changing thinking about what's possible, the new possibilities arise.
Mm-hmm.
So if nothing changes, nothing changes.
I mean, I feel like one of the biggest lessons learned, or some of the takeaways from the research that you and other folks at NASA
Right.
and in space research in general, for me, is just that optimization of resource utilization, right? Is that if we're going to go to space, I mean, you mentioned all of these limitations that we have in
Right.
taking up water and taking up food and using energy, and the CO2 and ethylene scrubbers and all the stuff that we have to take with us to
Right.
grow food in space. And so how can we limit the resources? How can we reuse the resources and be
Right.
self-sufficient and close as many loops as possible, right? So that we
Right.
never have to send something up again to replenish a space station or the colony on Mars or whatever.
Or the colony or Mars, and where's that optimization of what you take with you, and how do you reuse it? How do you?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of decision making, but ultimately that's the question.
I mean, do you see those lessons being applied in vertical farms and CEA here on Earth, or are there lessons that have been learned through that space research that need to kind of percolate down to our terrestrial applications?
I see them beginning to be applied, and
Okay.
You mentioned there in the introduction. I was involved with the group. Many had some exposure to NASA directly or indirectly with research. Was the SEEDS, the Controlled Environment Agriculture Design Standards.
Yeah.
And that was an effort to go and say, we have an industry that is saying we're saving so much water. We're much more energy efficient. It's a sustainable closed system production that's going forward. What's that really mean? And to establish, what does that really mean? That there are always competing efforts. You live in that in, temperature and humidity control. They're always fighting each other. And so in a sustainability, it is, what is the cost of recovering nutrients from water? How do you recycle that water? What we're seeing are some groups are really trying to do that. They're recovering water, reutilizing it, reprocessing it. Humidity and condensate is being collected. trying to be reused. There are the challenges of, on a commercial scale, have the materials caught up? You alluded to that earlier. Have they caught up to the point that how many times can I do this before I start getting toxicity? How much time can I run through before salts start accumulating? When do my nutrient imbalances appear? It's going to take time, but I see it beginning to occur. People looking at it. It's not only SyNRGE, but there are other organizations out there that are setting benchmarks and standards of, all right, how do we measure how efficient we are? How efficient am I at converting a photon to a product? What's that actually mean? How much energy is going in? Is that sustainable? How am I getting there? Whoa, that's an expensive proposition. It's an interesting challenge, but what I'm beginning to see, or as those questions are being asked, that the individuals are asking themselves, they begin to relook and rethink their operations. Ultimately, a commercial operation's got to be sustainable, has got to make money. And, you can coast along on different ways for a while, but ultimately it's got to be able to sustain more output than input, more cash in than cash out, and that it's got to flow and it's going to cycle. And it's going to take time. I think there are possibilities for integrating the inputs and outputs closer, co-locating sources of CO2 to users of CO2 to processors of the waste material or the compost, whether you're using hydroponics or media, and building an ecosystem around controlled environment agriculture, the whole system, not just the production of cannabis or lettuce or tomatoes.
Right. And I mean, sustainability, we tend, some people I think use the term sustainable for environmental sustainability, and others use the term sustainable as in terms of an industry or a company, or
right.
Just staying in the black, so to speak, in terms of,
right.
of profits and making money or revenue stream, I guess. But I don't think that they are mutually exclusive. I don't think that they even necessarily are in conflict with each other, those two terms.
No.
Because, right? Gary's
view is that they are intimately connected. They are, to look at one versus the other is very, very short-sighted, because if you grow that industry or that facility to a point that it is making money, but it utilizes the resources, we've all seen them. They run out of the money, the costs show up, and the industry collapses. And what's left is no industry, and the local community is once again a blighted place. So if you can build either that social community, the environmental, it's our air and our water and our natural resources, and that production of food within a community, they can all thrive. But it requires a commitment to place value on that community. It pays value on those natural resources, as well as placing value upon the industry. And unfortunately, too much of that is adversarial, but ultimately, I think we all want the same thing. We want to be relatively happy, relatively prosperous, and relatively safe.
And I appreciate that SyNRGE is out there, and in the documentation, the reporting, the metrics that's associated with that, and to help growers understand, the resources that they're using, why they're making some of the choices that they're making in terms of operations and design. Have there been many operators who have who have beta tested or who have gone through the seeds process yet?
We're currently in the beta testing, the
Okay.
pilot phase. So we should be coming out of that in, I don't know, the next 3 to 4 months.
Okay.
And what we're seeing out of that is exactly that questioning of, I had not thought about that. Okay, ooh, I can't do that. Or this is not going to be that hard to do. And depending upon what the operation is, the decisions are different. But what we're seeing is, as the growers are working through this comprehensive worksheet, it's like 150 questions of good, better, and best. And so it's like not a quick check mark, but it requires thinking about your operation at every level. And what are the choices you are making? I mean, you get points for automation and consistency. You also get points for, bringing in community and localness and having community, engagement. Sometimes they compete with each other. You have more automation, there's less people. So where are you placing those particular, values? Can you scale and create more jobs? But it's requiring, and I'm, as the organization and myself, I don't really place any judgment on either one of those decisions. What Seeds provides is a tool for the growers and owners to look at their operations and look at their decision making. Are they in alignment with their ethos, their words that they think they're doing? Or at the very least, it provides a direction to meet other requirements that are out there. I mean, certainly there's, a lot of requirements, and you've been, intimately involved in developing those in California. Those are all referenced to, you've got to meet the minimum of this. You've got to do this to be good. You've got to meet the minimum. You hit there, you got to be better, and best. So, linking to an awareness of those regulations. Florida doesn't have the same regulations as California, but we want the Florida growers to be aware that that's a benchmark they should be aiming for. And they can aim for it, and it's achievable.
You're in beta testing right now. If growers wanted to check this out or participate, are you guys accepting new applications right now? Or are you kind of getting through the beta testing and then we'll launch a new version?
New applications at this point. We've gone through startup phases. We've got our structures in place. We're getting feedback from the community, from the growers, on what those standards are, so that, reach out to Seeds. It's ceads.ag, and fill out the form and we'll get back to you.
Nice. And is this for operating facilities or for like new construction in the planning phase?
It is both. At this point, we've been beta testing with operating facilities, because they're operating facilities. What our ultimate goal is that this would be a vehicle for new facilities to look at and provide benchmarks in their design, so they can begin to design around these points, this certification, and recognizing it's going to be a slow project, not unlike LEEDs, where it's a voluntary effort, but when it has value in the market, people are looking for this. You can design to a LEEDs building or not. You can design to a seed standard or not. And that is ultimately our goal, is that as new facilities come in, they will be thinking, sustainability, energy use efficiency, minimum input out for maximum output from the very beginning. It's not an afterthought.
Yeah. And I think one of the biggest impacts that LEED made for commercial buildings and residential buildings is that, I think it was first started either late 90s or early 2000s. And it was a real stretch right? For owners and contractors and designers to meet these standards, either at a minimum level or a very high platinum level of certification. And I got LEED accredited in 2008, and it was still a big challenge. A lot of people were like, oh my God, this is so much paperwork. This is so much work. There's not enough places where we can get recycled materials, or, this and that and the other. And, it took probably 15 years. And by the time, 2015 rolls around, 50% of those credits just became industry standard practice, because, right, so much infrastructure built up around this idea that people wanted to be sustainable. They wanted a LEED plaque on the wall of their building, and they wanted to demonstrate that they were, implementing best design and operational practices. And so suddenly it was easy, right? And so they kept having to move the needle, which is a great thing. And so I wonder, for SyNRGE, is that kind of one of your goals too? Is, you got to start with something, right? And to understand where people are at and what they're doing. But do you see SyNRGE as maybe moving the industry?
I do. I do. I see SyNRGE moving an industry, and as well as the other organizations that are, this kind of building this organization within SyNRGE, that here is what is needed. It doesn't exist. We have some standards that I don't think can be met to get the best. They're theoretically possible, but that leads research, that leads grants, that leads the academics to say, okay, let's get from point A to point B, because there is a need. There is a requirement. If we can get there, we can move this needle from point A to point B. And as an analogy, I think of that in terms of the LEDs. We started looking in terms of lights. They were costing a little red, LED was $3. A blue LED was $35. To build, a panel was thousands of dollars of hand putting them together, of really low outputs. So fast forward, the demand increased, the price came down, efficiencies came up, engineers started looking, okay, how do I build a luminaire for this little thing? How can I put a coating on this little bitty chip that's a luminaire to illuminate the light? And then the energy efficiencies were coming out. And then regulations and incentives started moving an industry to it. So, suddenly Europe is completely transitioning away from high pressure sodium lamps. US is doing it on a different level and a different means, but it's happening. And it wasn't possible until it looked possible. There was no reason to invest in that infrastructure until one had a reason to invest. And I think SyNRGE is going to play a role in that. We set a standard, that we have technologies, there is a demand, and at first it starts in a research lab, but somebody puts in, say, a greenhouse, a 40-acre greenhouse. Well, suddenly that requires some infrastructure for somebody somewhere, and they become successful, then that ecosystem grows. And that's what we're very hopeful it can be, a vehicle to stimulate that and be a part of that growing world, this new world of controlled environment agriculture.
Yeah. It's a good segue to one of my last questions, and I was going to actually ask it a different way, but now I want to ask you a different way than what I originally had in mind. That didn't make any sense.
It doesn't have to.
What is your vision for the future of controlled environment agriculture? I was going to originally ask you about space, but now I kind of want to make it broader than that. What do you see happening with indoor agriculture in general, in whatever terms?
When I left working at NASA and formed SyNRGE, it with the express purpose of using those insights and knowledge and that really, really cool stuff I got to do, to growing plants in space, to applying it here on Earth to solve some of the coming problems, to help feed people here on Earth. So what I see is an increase in controlled environment agriculture. I see an emphasis on more greenhouses. I'm seeing that because you can use the sunlight, but they're going to have to be in appropriate places. You can put them closer to cities. You can reduce your transportation costs. New centers of glass house or plexiglass or greenhouse control are going to appear. Indoor agriculture is going through a transition now from the early pioneers and some crashing and then some surviving and lessons learned, that it will become far more routine. And we won't think about it as like, look at this. This is really neat. It still is. It doesn't stop being any neater, but it will become more routine for these crops that keep people healthy. I'm seeing an expansion into the phytonutrient-rich plants, medicinal plants other than cannabis, some ethnically important plants that are in particular cultures and ethnicities. As the population grows, it becomes more city. Those traditional foods don't become any less traditional. You just can't get the ingredients. How do you get fresh local ingredients? You grow them inside where you have population centers. So the diversity of food is going to go up. The ability to build infrastructure, that circularity, if you will, of placing of these indoor facilities, next to a refinery or a brewery or someplace putting in CO2, or utilizing, the plants and their abilities. Say you're growing ornamentals that comes in that has some capability of removing toxins from indoor farms, sick building syndromes. Not as bad as a problem as it used to be, but at least not in the US, but certainly in other parts of the world. You bring that air in, purified out, through a plant canopy into the building. So you have nasty outside air that's not so nasty inside air. The plants can process it, deactivate it, remove CO2, be a biological filter while producing food within a city of high density. So I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but I envision this indoor agriculture or advances in lighting and control technology are going to enable integration of plants much more deeply within the cities and communities.
I love that vision. I want that vision to be a reality, for sure.
Well, you're working towards it, so we certainly do.
Yeah.
I appreciate you're on the front lines. You're on the front lines, and it's always hard to see the vision on the front lines at times.
That's true. Sometimes it just feels like walls or barriers are always in front of you. But there are glimmers of light, and this industry has developed really quickly, right? I mean, it feels like a long time, but it's not, right? I mean, just you said 40 years ago, right? NASA was first attempting to use LED lights to grow plants. I mean, that feels like a long time, but that's in terms of technology development and how we're applying it. It's not.
It's not. It is not. It is transforming. I mean, that was probably before the iPhone.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And even thinking it just about the adoption or the transition from high pressure sodium to LED lamps. I mean, 5 years ago, most growers thought you were crazy unless you were trying to grow in a vertical farm, because that was the only lamp choice you had, right? Because you wanted to get those lights so close to the plants. And now, and now I don't know that it's necessarily industry standard practice for all crops, but everybody is looking at it. If they're not transitioning, they have an R&D space where they're testing it.
They got something over to the side, there's like, you can only get light penetrated into the canopy from a double-ended HPS, but they're photons, man. They're photons.
Exactly.
They don't care where they come from. You start looking at some of those questions, and our understanding of how to use these narrow spectrum lights have changed. Because much of that is on the mindset. If you go back as horticulturists and indoor agriculturists and controlled environments, we have been entirely dependent upon human lighting to drive what we do. We originally, the first lights, that it was before 1900. You had those carbon arc lights were being used to grow plants, but that was all that was available. Really neat stuff. But then we started looking at fluorescent lights because, well, that was it. Then high pressure sodium lights and metal halides. And, well, we're not going to get the same spectra. Well, the only reason we knew what those plants looked like because that was our only choice for 20 years of growing plants. Now suddenly we had this smorgasbord and an infinite opportunity to define the spectrum, and it overwhelms us. Now we're beginning to understand what we can do to get the form, to get the function, to control some of the secondary products. When do we put this colored light onto this? What's the spectrum and the timing and the quantity? We didn't know, it wasn't possible to ask these questions 15 years ago.
That's a good point. And also, I think we've learned that plants are not one-dimensional either, that the light isn't the only thing that affects how they grow, right? And that you change the light and it changes its water and nutrient uptake. It changes what temperature and humidity you want and what the leaf temperature is going to be. And so, I think some of the people who maybe have failed in making that transition kind of still think of the plant as one-dimensional and don't think about all the other variables and parameters that are interacting with the plant that might need adjusting.
That's a really good point, because we know that, let's say, stomatal control, responds differently to the blue wavelengths of light than it does to the red wavelengths of light. So as you start altering that, your water, your humidity, your temperature, all of those dynamics change. One plant's not a problem. You get a full canopy in a closed room, it's big stuff. And that was not a problem when you only had one light source, because we had figured that out. Mm-hmm. Extension service had said when you get this much light and this much humidity, you cut back light or you do this EPD, but the spectrum are all the same. And it was really good work. But now those parameters have changed, because I'm not responding just to the mercury line of a fluorescent lamp. I'm responding to 2 lines that I have control of, or 3, or a broad spectrum in the middle of a white LED. And it depends upon the white LED, what that particular mix is.
Yeah, a lot of variables. It's almost an infinite number of variables.
There are, but here is, in Gary's view, the beautiful thing, that plants are very good at integrating those multiple variables. And that, I've grown plants under a lot of different spectrum. And I'd say for the most part, they grow pretty well. They may not look exactly the same as each one, but their yields are productive. I can make, lettuce redder or greener or curlier or straighter. But in the end, I can grow that lettuce under a wider range of light because it's adaptable to it. And that is our challenge, is getting that middle ground. What we want the plants to do for us And then we can give those that environments so they can provide it. And we want it consistently day in and day out. And the very best growers know how to do that. I don't think the very best machines have learned how to do that yet.
I love that word adaptable, and the simplicity and beauty of that when thinking about plants and just living organisms in general. I feel like with controlled environment agriculture, I mean, the word control is in that term, and we're trying to control these variables, trying to control a plant that is a living, dynamic, changing, evolving organism over just a few weeks, right? Over just a few months, and many, many times. And exactly. And to think of it as adaptable, not just something that we want to control, but something that we can sort of allow the plant to express itself, to be itself, but to do it in a consistent way can be a good thing.
Right. There's a lot of genetic potential.
Yes.
In all of those things. And we're only understanding bits of them now because we have new tools to play with. But identifying how we can do that is a challenge. And the control is, I love engineers. I really do. I really do.
I feel like a backhanded compliment is coming.
No, that it is a very sincere compliment. But the challenge is that in engineering, it's very precise. There are these relationships, there are flow charts, one thing leads to another. And you can get one to another, or maybe two or three. And there is the reduction to each of that. We solve problem A to do problem B to solve problem C. And the biology is very quick and dynamic that we need to adjust to. One of my favorite, party tricks is, plant physiologists have party tricks. I've got a little light sensor, just a little PAR sensor. I've also got a little spectroradiometer, but the light sensor is my favorite. So I go out and, and let that show up, and you got like 2,000, 1,500, whatever that PAR is. Then I take a single leaf and put it on top of it. And so that 1,000 will go down to 100. 90% of that light is taken out of. You've done the experiment. We've all seen that, and we measure it. But when you think about it at the speed of light, what is 2.3 times 10 to the 23 meters per second, which is now passing through a leaf that's about a millimeter, which is 1 times 10 to the negative 4 meters in diameter. So within, a fraction of a second, 1 to 10 to the negative 17th, 1 trillionth of a second, 90% of that energy in that photon has been absorbed, moved up an electron chain, moved down, and converted to something that we will ultimately use as energy. We'll turn it into a sugar or a carbon. That is the dynamics and the quickness and the time scales that we're working on. And we take that so much for granted. When you say, we get a photosystem 1 or photosystem 2, but those lights are in, trillionths of a second is harvesting that light, and it's going somewhere to make something happen. And that is what we are not trying to control, but so much manage. And the control systems come from the engineering world, Gary's perception, because we're altering and we're controlling, and that's only right and proper. But ultimately, we're managing an environment to get the plant to do what we want it to do, whether it's to be tall and bushy, or tall and straight, short and bushy, have a lot of terpenes, make not too many terpenes, be deep red, be small. It is that managing that environment and those incredible complexity of physiology to make that happen.
I love what you just said. It kind of made me chuckle because I was thinking plants aren't only the dynamic living organism in this equation, humans are too.
We are.
We can't make up our mind either. We want more terpenes or less terpenes. We want more red or more green. Like, come on, plants are like, make up your mind, human.
Make up their mind, and they don't care. They will respond to that environment. They will
Plants
respond to that.
So cool.
They will respond to the environment that we provide them. And so, that is how far can we push them to make them provide what we want them to do. And we've selected, as a species, just a handful of plants that we work with, that we use for food, we use for medicine. Out of the tens of thousands, there's only a handful. So, let's get to know our friends as if our life depends on them, because, well, it does.
For sure. And I think plants are probably more adaptable than we are in some ways.
If we walk away, it's not going to bother them at all.
Exactly. All right, Gary. So last question while we're loving on plants. What do plants crave?
Yeah, we are loving on plants. What do plants crave? Plants crave an environment where they can thrive. What plants crave when we put them in a controlled environment or an indoor. If I were a sentient plant, I would want, that grower to understand what my needs are and give it to me, because those plants crave that environment in order to produce what we want them to. We selected them for it. We talked about wheat. Wheat needs us. We need wheat. So it craves attention. It craves an understanding. And plants crave somebody who appreciate that they are a part of the system, not just a commodity.
I like that. You don't think plants are sentient? You can't make that comment without me following up on it.
Plants communicate in many different ways. They respond to light. They have volatiles. They are very neat abilities to send signals back and forth. There are signals throughout the plant. Hollies are very neat when we don't grow them in inside environments, but they're generally smooth leaves until they start getting grazed on. Then their morphology changes and all of the leaves will begin getting the little pointy things that we love at Christmas and holly. There are, communication networks of chemicals that move from one population to another. Some various volatiles, various isoprenes. There are a whole bunch of really neat chemistry that goes on in the physiology. Is that responding to an environment? Is that a sentient being? Is our attempt to try and put meaning to a plant? I don't know. What I do understand is a single plant does not operate in isolation. And we can think that they do, but we've all seen populations move out. We've seen things we don't, show up in environments or little pockets. I'm sure you've seen them. I certainly have. I can't figure out what's going on here, where we have an environment that's consistent, nutrients are consistent, you're in big ponds or big flows, but something's not right, but everything around it is okay. And so if I roll back to much earlier in our conversation, much of that I think may be related to this microbial world in the bottom, that we have systems we don't understand that are sensing this problem and protecting the rest of the community in much the way that plant pathogens will start invading. They'll kill all the cells around to contain it. And beneficial organisms, there are chemical signals, friend or foe. Pathogens and beneficials both have to penetrate through a root into the cells. They start moving up through the intercellular space. And then suddenly, you're a friend. Ooh, you can hang out here and we'll form a nodule, and you can hang out and we'll exchange fixed nitrogen for fixed carbon. Or you're a foe, we're going to kill off the root and protect the rest of the plant. There's some neat signaling that goes on. I don't know what they are, but there's some very subtle and dynamic protective devices that these organisms we depend upon have.
Wow. It sounds like they might even be a little social in a way, the way that they kind of group together sometimes or protect each other.
If they're not, we make them be social.
Touche. Grow with these 99,999 other plants in this room.
Yeah. Let's all go in. Let's all. Let's all get along. Let's put it in 100,000 of you in 3 stories, and
all right.
Each be individuals, but look exactly alike on the way out.
Exactly.
And to a surprising extent, they accommodate us on that.
They do. So that wraps up my official questions, but I have a few rapid fire questions that I didn't send to you ahead of time. So they're just meant to be quick answers, 1 word, 1 sentence. If you want to expand on anything, please do, but they're meant to be quick.
All right.
Okay. Number 1, are plants introverts or extroverts?
Depends on the plant.
Okay. That feels like a cop-out answer.
Of course not. It's not a cop-out answer. Let's think of something like, kudzu. Kudzu is definitely an extrovert. It goes out, it takes over everything. It climbs up trees, it smothers buildings, it hides along with its friends, which would be the morning glories and the poison ivies and the blackberries. Those kind of things would be like extroverts. But let's look at like little jack-in-the-pulpits, which are hiding down in the litter, down in the early spring, only 3 or 4 days deep in that they show up and they do their thing where you can't be fined. Those are definitely, introverts. They want to be kept by themselves. They are solitary plants. So you get big populations. You're in California, you walk your way up the meadows, up the mountains, you'll see whole meadows there of columbine. Oh, okay, they're a very social group. But back on the other side, there in the middle, you may end up with, like one single echinacea back in the side. I think that's probably being, an introvert, being a little bit, isolated. It depends on the plant and where they at. Some grow together, some do not.
Okay, now I love that answer.
That wasn't a cop-out at all.
That was a really good answer. What have plants taught you?
What have plants taught me? They have taught me to adapt to where I am at, to take and do the adaptations, do the adjustments, if not to thrive, to survive in what environment one is placed in. And they have taught me that in the right environment, one can thrive. Plants have also taught me that where you are naturally at, or where you come from, or where that origin is not necessarily, you can thrive in lots of other places. Think of kudzu coming to the south. Where you begin does not necessarily mean where you're going to thrive and prosper and be king of the mountain. So there is a fluidity in the plants. There's an adaptability. It taught me some patience with seeds that can lay dormant for days or years or months or decades and then come to fruition. The trees and the olives, in a lot of the fruit trees, a bit of adversity before you can fully blossom and be prosperous. You need the chilling and the cooling. The buds have got to be dormant. They've got to be exposed to cold before they will come and flower and actually produce an apple, peach, plum, or a pear, or an olive. So there are a lot of lessons one can learn from the plants if one pays attention.
That's beautiful. If you were going up in space, what is the one plant you would take with you?
Ooh, now that one is a really really hard one. I'm going to have to put a pin in that one.
Okay.
I'm going to have to put a pin in that one because that one plant, I just had one plant, that would mean that I am not having to rely upon it for food.
Correct.
I mean, it's going to have to be some perennial that's going to be continuously growing. It's going to have to be very, very adaptable. And it's going to have some connection back to Mother Earth. So what I am thinking now, I would probably take a little philodendron, because a little philodendron, they come down, and I used to have those when I was a child, and you can cut them off and they will prosper, they'll make roots very easily and they get vines, but they're really neat that if they start growing up the tree, their leaves get larger and larger and larger. So they're a gigantica. You can get them the size of plates or larger. But if they lay up on the ground, they're very, very small. And that's what you're sold as the ornamental. So, I might have, if that was the only one I had, I couldn't eat it, but it would clean out my atmosphere. It would take very low light, be easy to propagate. And I could, fill up my little space cubicle with vegetation that had the scents and smells and color and diversity of a variegated philodendron leaf.
And it reminds you of home. I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, so last question. Imagine you're ziplining in a rainforest.
I love this question. Okay, go on.
What would you rather encounter? Spider monkeys, wasps, or my heavy-handed wife?
Your heavy-handed wife 1,000 times over. Because without her, there would be no wasps, there would be no spider monkeys, there would be no platform 100 feet in the air, squunching through the mud up a mountaintop in the middle of who knows where.
Oh my God.
Hands down on that.
Well, thank you, Gary. This was so fun and enlightening, and honestly, just a beautiful conversation. Thank you for your insights, and thank you for loving plants so much, and for all the work that you've done.
Thank you for the opportunity to chat. Most of my talks don't go down this road. So thank you for taking this particular road. But, ultimately, it is that ability to use the plants in these environments that are incredibly artificial, yet understanding, and I might even go so far as say respecting those particular needs so that those requirements, so we can meet them so that the plants can respond to maintain our survival. We are entirely dependent upon them for our food, our water, our oxygen, our absolute survival. And as we bring them into tighter and tighter controls, as we have the technologies to understand them, this handful of plants that we have chosen and selected over eons are still going to continue to do what they do. So it behooves us not to take that for granted.
Agreed. Well, thank you, Gary. I will see you next month. I will see you at NCRA.
Next month.
Thank you again, and we'll let you know when we are gonna post this.
Okay, thank you very much. I enjoyed it, and it's always great to see you.
You too.
All right.
Thanks, Gary. All right. Bye.